Britain in 1943 felt tense and hushed, like a station before dawn, with ration queues, shaded windows, and letters folded into careful pockets. Along quaysides, engines coughed, then fell quiet as if listening for news. The war seemed to press on every wall and cupboard, yet most plans stayed hidden, moving by rumor, courier, and coded hint. In this atmosphere, a single false trail could weigh as much as a battalion. The episode you are about to hear concerns a drifting body, a chained briefcase, and papers that suggested an Allied strike far from its true mark. Much of what follows rests on public accounts, officer recollections, and fragments preserved in archives. Some sequences remain uncertain and may have been reshaped by memory, rivalry, or official caution. Where the record opens gaps, this program uses restrained inference to bridge them while staying near the known contour of events. No claim here is absolute. Assertions are weighed, not declared, and conclusions are left to the period itself. What seems clear is that an invented life, populated with habits and minor clutter, was carried into hostile hands and read as truth. The consequences may have shifted troops and softened shores. Whether brilliance or luck led the way remains a question the era never fully answered. The coast felt ordinary enough on that gray morning, with gulls circling lazily and fishermen checking nets for salvage after a rough tide. Patrols walked familiar paths, boots scuffing wet stones, eyes trained to notice unusual flotsam among boards and weed. From a short distance, the discovery appeared grim but unsurprising for wartime, a uniformed corpse bearing the scars of rough water and long hours adrift. The smell of salt and oil hung low. Local officials, bound by routine and mindful of chain of custody, moved with deliberate care as they surveyed the scene. A briefcase, secured to the wrist, drew particular attention. The object felt heavy with possibility, yet it also looked ordinary, the sort of thing a staff officer might carry between meetings and field visits. Observers whispered about a transport mishap or perhaps a crash beyond the horizon, and then fell quiet. Paper tags and modest belongings suggested a life that could be traced through letters, receipts, and idle notes. The effect was disarming because it felt so human. The man seemed to have existed in the small ways that are hard to fake, through forgettable appointments and gentle trifles that accumulate in pockets. The local procedure moved forward without spectacle. The body was recorded, the items cataloged, and messages passed up channels that preferred facts to speculation. A few present lingered on details whose significance was unclear at first glance. A ticket stub might indicate origin or only bad luck. A personal letter might hint at an assignment or merely affection. The sea had blurred edges, but the case and its contents carried a strange clarity, like a room left in a hurry. Authorities recognized that such material, if genuine, could interest higher command. They also recognized that any misstep could invite unwanted attention. The documents, once dried and arranged, bore the marks of routine military correspondence, terse but polite, seeded with names and places that sounded plausible to ears accustomed to briefings. There were suggestions of forthcoming operations wrapped in the tone of everyday scheduling, rather than fanfare. That tone mattered. Grand claims would have raised suspicion. Mundane details, by contrast, traveled smoothly through the mind, creating a sense of natural order. The chain of events that followed was shaped by habit as much as by drama. Uniforms were pressed, signatures checked, and stamps examined against known patterns. The seaside find moved inland onto desks where intelligence officers compared impressions with prior reports. They noted the apparent authenticity of minor marks, the wear on folders, the scatter of incidental items that usually come from a real working day. Even in cautious offices, the ordinary can be persuasive. Those who handled the case did not claim certainty. They recorded observations, flagged oddities, and prepared discreet summaries for those above them who would weigh risk against opportunity. Was the body a courier lost to misfortune, or a carefully arranged messenger from the other side? The distinction mattered deeply, yet it proved difficult to resolve on first pass. Some officials pointed to the cruel tidiness of the discovery. Others observed that wartime seas swallow many lives and occasionally return them with undelivered errands still attached. The weather turned while they debated, and a thin rain softened footprints along the quay. By then, the briefcase had already begun its quiet journey through official corridors, escorted by men trained to hold their thoughts behind still faces. Outside, the town settled into the tasks of afternoon, unaware that a portfolio of pages might set pieces in motion far beyond its streets. If there was a design behind the find, its strength lay in patience. The narrative of a life had been constructed with trusted rhythms, not loud claims, and it invited readers to fill gaps with familiar assumptions. The body, sadly convincing, anchored the story in flesh and consequence. The case, chained to the wrist, implied simple procedure rather than theater. Within that frame, the document spoke in the voice of routine necessity. By evening, the seaside incident had become an official matter destined for higher scrutiny. The tide washed new foam over the stones, erasing signs of the morning except in ledger books and sealed envelopes. Those who had first seen the body took their suppers in silence, turning over the image of the clasped hand and the dark case. They understood that the war sometimes shifted on accidents. Whether this was accident or intention would soon be decided by people they would never meet, poring over the same papers in distant rooms where lamps burned late and windows were kept closed against curious eyes. The rooms where decisions formed were warmer than the streets, with coal heat, closed curtains, and a dull clatter of teacups set down between pages. The recovered papers lay across a wide table, surrounded by officers who balanced skepticism with urgency. Each item was inspected for pattern and tone, not simply content. A date might indicate tempo. A salutation might reveal familiarity between desks. A casual reference to supplies could suggest timing if read against other fragments. Analysts compared what they saw with previous reports, tracing alignments and gaps. The writing seemed neither theatrical nor clumsy. It had the cadence of normal work, the sort that passes through in trays without comment. That cadence created comfort, and comfort can be perilous during war. A few noticed small inconsistencies, then cautioned colleagues not to overread minor smudges or water strain. Paper carried marks easily, seas were unforgiving, and offices often tolerated imperfections when pressure rose. Others argued that genuine documents usually reflect many hands and rough handling. The small flaws, they said, might actually argue for authenticity. The discussion never reached consensus, yet a leaning formed as hours stretched. The portrait that emerged suggested Allied intentions aimed not at Sicily but toward other coasts. Certain place names appeared in ways that felt incidental, as if tucked into personal notes by writers concerned with basic coordination. Credulity grew because the papers avoided big statements. They relied on dull chores that accompany large plans. That was disarming. Intelligence work often prizes the ordinary, even while hunting the rare. Two indicators carried particular weight in the room. First, the harmony between unrelated items supported the same destination without blunt repetition. Second, the personal ephemera lining the file created a believable life that nested inside the official tone. It is difficult to counterfeit small habits well, and difficult to disguise them when they are genuine. A realist countered that a skilled opponent could compose such hints with care, using a body as the proof no paper could supply on its own. The remark hung in the room, and some fell quiet. Outside, the city moved through evening rituals, with trams clanging and pedestrians hurrying under weak lamps. Inside, the senior officers pressed for a recommendation. They required neither a speech nor a dissertation, only a judgment about the paper's likely truth. War compresses debate into choices. The choice here was whether to shift weight accordingly, to reinforce sectors flagged by the papers, and to release units toward threatened islands and peninsulas. If the file was genuine, rapid action might thwart an Allied scheme. If it was a plant, the cost could be severe. Time mattered, and time rarely offers a full record. The officers did not claim certainty as they agreed on a response. They cited the cumulative pull of plain detail, the apparent interplay between personal fragments and formal lines, and the scarcity of counterindications strong enough to reverse the balance. A note was dispatched, Messages moved through channels that preferred speed to decoration. Orders followed, quietly at first, then with firmer tone, as subordinate staffs translated conclusions into movement. Warehouses opened at odd hours. Railway yards prepared new schedules. Reports by radio and courier described preliminary repositioning consistent with the paper's guidance. Within the analysis rooms, a few remained troubled. They listed questions in their notebooks for later review, should outcomes allow for post-mortems. The strongest doubt rested on human tendency rather than technical signs. People often accept material that confirms their prior sense of threat. If leaders already feared certain coasts, a stack of convincing letters might simply give permission to act. Even so, the net effect was clear by midnight. The file had entered the bloodstream of decision. A constructed life, if constructed, it was, now shaped the balances on a map, many miles away from the cold table where the pages still dried at the edges. The lamps were finally lowered. The last to leave touched the case with 2 fingers, as if to test its weight once more, then closed the door on a judgment that could not be undone by second thoughts. Outside, the rain had stopped. Streets shone with thin puddles and scattered grit. The city looked unchanged, though trains by morning would carry men and guns toward shores their commanders read as threatened by a blow that might never come. The first indications came quietly, almost like weather notes, then accumulated into a pattern that sharpened by the day. Intercepts spoke in clipped phrases about convoys expected near islands east of the Central Passage. Observers along harbors counted vessels preparing for redeployment, not in parade lines, but in unglamorous strings that signaled haste. Reports from agents, where available, hinted at confusion among staff who struggled to meet new timetables. None of these items, in isolation, confirmed the central premise. Together, however, they suggested that senior command now treated certain coasts as primary targets. Sicily, by comparison, looked thinner than feared. The difference was not absolute, and no one sensible claimed a miracle. Yet the readiness on secondary fronts appeared stronger than recent weeks, while positions overlooking Sicily showed signs of drained attention. Shore batteries remained, but ammunition trains slowed. Garrison numbers held, yet experienced units were earmarked elsewhere. For Allied planners, these shifts seemed to validate the deception, though they knew caution was essential. A single storm, a straying convoy, or a rumor passed at the wrong tavern could upend any model. Still, the map on the wall told a story that could not be ignored. Forces were moving in the direction the papers had pointed. A second indicator reinforced the first. When leaders believe a narrative, their subordinates begin to echo it in routine memos. Such echoes appeared in mundane requests for supplies, which now referenced locations the planted briefcase had implied. The tone was not celebratory, it was bureaucratic and brisk, the administrative hum that always accompanies redeployment. That hum has weight. It is difficult to fake across many desks for long. The planners compared this soundscape with earlier weeks. Before the briefcase surfaced, the pattern had favored a broader hedge, with Sicily near the top of probable lists. After the file took root, attention scattered toward Greece and Sardinia, clipping margins from Sicily's defense. Meeting rooms across Allied staging grounds grew a little less tight. Officers allowed themselves a short breath, nothing more. They understood that misdirection never eliminates danger, it only bends it. If the enemy recovered from the initial pull, countermeasures could arrive quickly. Siege lines would stiffen, and landing beaches would bristle with renewed care. For the moment, though, the enemy seemed content to reinforce the wrong doors. Ships continued their quiet rehearsals, crews refining small habits that reduce chaos when ramps finally drop. The men did not know about a body found along a distant coast, or the letters that traveled inside a weathered case. They prepared in the same way they always prepared, mindful of orders, gear, and the need to sleep when chance allowed. Their commanders watched the southern traffic and tried to read intention through motion. Intelligence officers remained divided about causation. Some argued the briefcase had directly changed minds at the top. Others suggested the papers merely confirmed a bias already present in enemy circles, nudging a decision that was almost made. The distinction mattered to historians, perhaps less to sailors about to approach a defended shore. What mattered in the days that followed was measurable, if not perfectly measurable. Reconnaissance noted fewer patrols in certain inlets and quieter roads behind key ridges. The quiet did not guarantee easy progress, only comparatively lighter resistance where it counted, particularly in the first hours of a landing. If the deception had worked, it had worked by treating ordinary life as evidence. Personal effects crafted a believable human frame. Routine letters established a plausible administrative flow. The sea delivered the story in a form most offices would accept: tragic, tidy, and urgent. Once inside the system, the story reproduced itself through schedules, requisitions, and revised maps. The Allies, meanwhile, resisted the temptation to change their own plan in response to success. They kept their line, released stage notices only when needed, and maintained the same outward pattern of preparation. Overconfidence could have spoiled the advantage faster than any enemy countermove. The nights felt long along the quays, with low voices, cigarette ends, and boots on iron ramps. On certain days, air crews described scattered clouds and temperate winds, favorable enough to proceed. The weight of waiting pressed most heavily on those who held the plan in their hands. They were the ones who could see the entire spread, from the charade that began with a corpse to the ships arranged like brackets across the sea. They kept their doubts private and stayed within discipline. If the enemy had truly swallowed the bait, the first reports after landfall would show it, not in bursts of celebration, but in the unexpected absences that ease a passage by degrees. The final nights before embarkation carried a fragile quiet that men remember for years. Allied signals continued to mark enemy movement that matched the false tale. It was not perfect, and caution never let go. Yet the overall picture seemed to hold. The deception, if deception it was, had entered the bloodstream and made its slow, practical changes to the enemy body. Soon, steel would test paper, and the result would be counted in yards gained and names on lists that arrived before dawn. Inside guarded offices, the success of the ruse was measured in memos and maps, yet a quieter ledger gathered beneath. A body had been used as a vehicle for ideas, and that reality settled slowly on those who handled the details. Clerks sealed files with steady hands, then paused longer than usual before extinguishing lamps. The practical steps were routine, but the implications were not. Wartime accepts many compromises, and people learn to work without turning every question into a speech. Even so, a sense of unease threaded through small conversations that never became minutes. The operation depended on the appearance of a lived life, rendered through letters and tokens. Those tokens now traveled further than their silent owner. The object chained to his wrist had done its work, yet the man remained a presence in the margins, a figure who offered no consent and could not object. The officers understood that this was not a parade. It was a measured calculation that traded one discomfort for a larger hope. They also understood that this calculus is never clean. The remains were recorded with care that felt both professional and protective. The chain of custody read like a discipline lesson, with initials aligned and dates crisp. That attention indicated more than procedure. It hinted at a desire to render respect where possible, to resist turning a human being into a mere instrument. People can be pragmatic without becoming indifferent, and many tried to hold that boundary. The success of the deception would be judged in lives spared on landing beaches. This judgment, however, would always contain uncertainty. No one could read the counterfactual with confidence. They could only weigh signals against outcomes and move forward. There was talk of precedent, of whether such measures might become easier after a single success. Some feared a slope toward routine exploitation. Others believed the rarity of the circumstances would prevent any slide. The file showed restraint in tone, avoiding triumph, avoiding morbid curiosity, and avoiding embellishment. The language stayed dry even when the stakes were high. Dry language can carry heavy weight because it does not demand belief. It simply records what happened and leaves the conclusion implied. A second indicator emerged in the way senior staff framed internal notes. They acknowledged the contribution of the planted life without naming it as victory. They wrote that misdirection appears to have shifted attention away from key beaches. They also wrote that risk remained high and that expected casualties should not be re-estimated downward without new evidence. That balance suggested an institutional instinct to temper pride. It also suggested recognition that a helpful outcome did not erase the moral cost. The use of a body was a hard fact. The planners did not celebrate it, and they did not condemn it in writing. They accepted it as one of those wartime necessities that cannot be neatly cataloged. The people closest to the work saw the composite person formed from paper, ink, and personal artifacts. They had helped assemble a life that felt ordinary enough to be trusted by strangers. They now watched that life ripple outward through enemy staffs, and they felt a mixture of relief and reluctance. If the deception failed, the cost would be borne by crews approaching fortified sands. If it succeeded, the cost remained in the choice itself, and in the silence around the choice. When letters travel farther than their writer, they gather new meanings. Here the letters did not deliver affection or news. They delivered pressure, redirected across the sea toward different garrisons. The man who carried them did not write them, yet they belonged to him in the most consequential sense. Those involved took comfort where they could. Some consoled themselves that the body might otherwise have been lost without record. Others believed the careful handling served as a form of belated acknowledgement. No one claimed that acknowledgement was sufficient. It simply stood as evidence that the planners recognized a line had been crossed, even if they believed it necessary. The days that followed brought further signs that the enemy had acted on the file's implications. The briefcase ceased to be an object in a room and became a distant force on a grid. Trains moved because of it. Units shifted because of it. Its influence could be read in station logs and harbor tallies. Those readings, however, did not settle the moral question. They only sharpened it. The more effective the deception, the more power it borrowed from the life it imitated. The record remains careful here, as if the writers understood future eyes would search for spectacle. They left little. They left structure, not flourish. They left enough to show that care was taken with the remains, and that private misgivings were present, though unrecorded, in direct language. People who carry secrets often express them in what they refuse to write. The unspoken principles seem to be this: if the ruse saved men from machine positions and mined approaches, it could be defended. If not, it could only be endured. The answer would not come from sentiment. It would come from the first hours of a landing, when everything turns on whether defenders look the wrong way for too long. Until then, the human cost stayed in a narrow corridor between duty and doubt. The briefcase had passed from flesh to paper to movement. The man at the center had no further say. Those who did have a say tried to use it in ways that spared other families a telegram. That is as close as anyone came to comfort, and even that felt incomplete. The tide moved on. Offices reopened. Officers returned to their ledgers. The moral residue did not fade, but it stopped insisting. It sat with the other burdens of a large war, the ones people learned to carry without display, because display would not change the arithmetic that awaited on the shore. The landings began under conditions that planners judged acceptable, with weather that allowed ships to hold formation and aircraft to keep their timing. The hour was chosen to favor surprise and to keep crews steady as they approached unknown reception. Sicily stood ahead, a rough triangle rising from the sea, its beaches lined in places with wire and guns, its interior cut by roads that turn easily into traps. The commanders did not expect a walk ashore. They expected a hard arrival. What they found varied by sector. In some approaches, defensive fire came late and ragged. In others, it stiffened quickly, reminding everyone that deception bends danger, but does not erase it. Signals teams tracked reports with close attention. They listened for patterns that would confirm the enemy had dispersed his strength. One indicator came from early prisoner statements that referenced urgent orders to reinforce islands farther east. Those orders sounded recent and harried. The second indicator came from artillery notes that logged lighter fire volumes in sectors where the enemy had previously shown more confidence. Combined, these hints suggested the deception had contributed to a thinner shield at key points. There were still losses. Landing is always costly when the margin is narrow. Yet commanders marked moments where the expected resistance did not appear on time, or where the counterattack lacked sufficient weight to push the first waves back into the surf. The map began to shift from possibility to presence. Beachheads expanded, sometimes by yards that felt like miles. Road junctions fell into Allied hands sooner than some timetables had predicted. These were not dramatic reversals. They were smaller efficiencies that add up when hours are short. The planners did not rewrite their understanding of war based on a single day. They noted that deception appears to have shaped the battle's opening rhythm. They also noted that friction remained in every direction. Units became separated in the dark. Equipment stuck where sand ran soft. Communication faltered when cables snagged or sets took spray. None of this changed the broader picture that the first phase had broken favorably. Senior staffs resisted the temptation to claim a cause beyond what could be supported. They credited training, steady seamanship, and the luck that always inserts itself into great plans. They also credited the drifting life that had moved enemy focus away from these beaches. In private, some asked how long the advantage would last. The enemy could recover from a wrong reading once real reports rolled in. New reserves could be summoned. Bottlenecks could be cleared. The question was whether the initial disruption had already fixed the shape of the contest. Early gains on a shore often determined the tempo inland. Here, the tempo seemed manageable. Machine positions were taken with less expenditure than feared. Crossroads were reached before dusk in several corridors. Airfields received attention according to plan rather than in emergency sequence. These outcomes owed much to people who would never be named in public lists. Tug crews that held lines straight, engineers who cleared obstacles quickly without fuss, liaison officers who kept orders plain. All of them moved within a space opened partly by the enemy's misreading. The progress remained contested. Towns fought to hold out until relief arrived. Hills demanded patience and cost blood. Senior command kept asking for reconnaissance that addressed the core uncertainty. Were large enemy reserves still seated on the wrong stools? The answers came with caution. Some reserve elements had indeed been committed in directions the papers had suggested. Others appeared to wait uncommitted, unsure of where to go. The lack of decisive concentration across from the main landings eased pressure at crucial hours. The planners kept their posture steady. They pushed where they could and they paused where supply had to catch up. They avoided flamboyance. Steady pressure won more than sudden flourish. After the first week, patterns settled. The operation had not collapsed into confusion, nor had it raced beyond its support. It advanced at a rate consistent with strong resistance that lacked coherence at decisive points. Public accounts later emphasized the courage and persistence of the men ashore, which is correct. The internal accounts also pointed to the quieter influence of a narrative carried by sea to a different shore. The Briefcase, in that sense, had walked ahead of the landing craft and nudged open a gate. When later committees sought to measure effect, they found few firm numbers that satisfied their appetite. They found patterns instead. They found enemy dispatches that mentioned threats that never came. They found supply orders directed toward the wrong stockpiles. They found command conferences scheduled in places that drew attention away from Sicily. These fragments created a circumstantial portrait that aligned with the observed ease in certain sectors. None of it proved necessity. Much of it suggested contribution. That was enough for professionals who rarely enjoy certainty. They cared less about tidy stories and more about whether a plan held under pressure. This plan held. The island was not taken in a day, and the conclusion remained many towns away. Yet the path through those towns had been made somewhat less steep because an invented life, presented with restraint, pulled eyes and guns toward other coasts. The sea rolled on under summer light, and ships repeated their routes with a rhythm that felt almost domestic after the first days. The men ashore learned local ground and local winds. They began to think about the next crossing, which lay on the far side of narrow straits. The Briefcase no longer appeared in their thoughts. Its work had been absorbed into the complexion of the battle, like a dye that fades after it changes the bath. Questions accumulated in the weeks after the island campaign turned in favor of the landing forces. The outcome looked clear on maps, but the causes remained contested in smaller rooms. Intelligence officers retrieved early assessments and compared them with results. Some argued the deception had been decisive in drawing defenders toward Greece and Sardinia. Others claimed the movement would have occurred for unrelated reasons, including internal fears and the natural impulse to guard longer coasts. Both sides acknowledged the same evidence, then arranged it into different stories. The absence of a clean counterfactual left plenty of space for interpretation. Two indicators came up repeatedly in these reviews. The first was the timing of enemy redeployments, which closely followed the arrival and circulation of the recovered papers. The second was the administrative chatter that echoed the planted narrative, where routine requisitions reflected a belief in threats away from Sicily. Neither indicator proved cause beyond doubt. Both created pressure within the room. Officers with a taste for caution noted that belief can be born from prior anxiety as easily as from new documents. If senior leaders already suspected a blow in the Eastern Basin, the briefcase might simply have granted permission to act more boldly on that suspicion. Different readers drew different lessons. The skeptics warned against overconfidence in deception as a universal solution. They urged careful limits and rare use. The proponents replied that the cost of a deception attempt, when thoughtfully designed, was modest compared with the potential relief on a beach. The record suggests a compromise between these views. Planners recognized value without granting magic. They stressed authenticity of detail rather than theatrical flourish. They also stressed patience, since a false narrative must enter another system quietly to endure. Outside the analysis rooms, the Army prepared for the next requirement on the mainland. Forward observers marked crossings and roads that would carry men north. The enemy, now responding to real pressure across narrow waters, began to adjust with more discipline. The window created by the earlier misreading could not last forever. New reports corrected old assumptions. Officers on both sides learned from the recent weeks. That is the normal cycle of war, where adaptation rarely sleeps. Within that cycle, the memory of the briefcase lived on as a case study rather than a banner. It showed that small, ordinary things carry unusual force when assembled with care. It also showed that such force depends on the reader's state of mind. Deception does not act alone. It travels on channels conditioned by fear, pride, and the tyranny of limited time. The post-mortems wrestled with a final question that refused closure. Was the body necessary, or could documents alone have sufficed? Most believe the body anchored the story in a way paper never could by itself. The physical circumstance created an event that officials were obliged to handle according to procedure. Procedure, in turn, created confidence. Confidence encouraged belief. Belief shaped movement. The chain is plausible, though parts of it will always remain inferred. No diary from an enemy headquarters offers a simple confession. What survives are edges and shadows. A few fragmentary notes hint at misgivings within their own analysis teams. A few other notes hint at pressure from above to accept the convenient reading at speed. Individuals within the process may have doubted, yet they kept pace with orders as trains began to roll. That is not unusual. Systems often carry doubts within them while still moving as if they were certain. The chapter ends with balance rather than verdict. The deception appears to have mattered, yet it did not carry the burden alone. Men still fought through towns and along hills, and ships still risked narrow approaches that could turn brutal with one miscalculation. If the briefcase lightened that burden at crucial hours, then its role was real, even if unquantified. If its effect simply nudged tendencies already in motion, then its value lay in marginal gains that prevented losses. Either way, the episode confirms a recurring truth of large conflicts. The ordinary is powerful when it looks like itself. Letters that sound like letters. Bills that look like bills. Lives that appear to have been lived. Added together with patience, such pieces can bend decisions without fanfare. The war did not pause to admire that craft. It moved on from one shore to the next, with the same blend of planning, chance, and endurance. Behind it, the questions remained, ready to surface whenever new plans teased the boundary between what is created and what is found. By late summer, the island campaign had opened a doorway toward the mainland, and staff officers traced new lines that crossed narrow straits and climbed difficult ground. The deception that began with a drifting body now sat in folders marked with discrete tabs, studied for lessons and guarded for need. Some readers saw a template that might be adapted in modest ways. Others warned that success can spoil judgment and that the same trick rarely works twice against a watchful enemy. Neither side could claim the final word. The outcome on the beaches suggested contribution rather than command. The papers seemed to have pulled weight from one flank and eased pressure on another. Yet the war carried on, and every new phase promised to reorder the balance of proof. There were signals that enemy staffs had revised their models and placed stronger emphasis on Sicily's lesson. There were also signals that simple caution would now dominate, with reserves kept closer to the center until firm reports forced commitment. In this unsettled space, planners returned to the basics. Build the next plan with clarity. Protect its timing. Keep the tone of deception, if any, natural and spare. Do not enlarge claims that cannot survive first contact. The program leaves the question open, as it must. Was the briefcase the hinge, or one of many quiet hands on the door? What can be said is limited, but firm. Authentic detail travels far. Patience multiplies effect. Systems carry their own predispositions, which the careful may harness. Ahead lies a coast where those lessons will be tried again, within hours that will feel longer than days. The record will lengthen, and the room for certainty may not. What waits across the water will decide how much paper can do against steel, and how much steel owes to paper it never saw.